Hi, welcome to session one of the sixth topic of the semester, Texas during the Civil Wars and Reconstruction from 1860 all the way to 1877. Once again, this is a whole new topic that is going to deal with Texas, looking at the Civil War, Texas in the Civil War itself. I labeled, of course, the title of this topic, Civil Wars, because we're going to take a very brief look also at the Civil War in Mexico, very briefly, to see also how Texas participated in a very indirect way. It's not going to participate, of course, in the Civil War in Mexico, but it was caught, if you will, between the two struggles, one in the North during the Civil War taking place in the United States, of course, and then roughly around the same period of time, we're going to see that in Mexico, there's going to be also a series of civil wars as well. They were called the Reform Wars, that we're not really going to delve very deep into the Mexican Civil Wars, but just looking at how Texas was caught in the middle, if you will, of those two episodes, if you will. We're going to place more emphasis, more attention to the U.S. Civil War because Texas participated in the U.S. Civil War on the side of the South, the Confederacy, of course. So it's going to be our focus of attention. And our topic is going to also look into the process of Reconstruction, the end of the Civil War, and also the process by which there's going to be a series of reforms implemented by the winning side, by the Union, in this case, by the Republicans, again, in the United States, that dominated Congress in terms of reshaping the South, reforming the South to end slavery and also provide voting rights to the freed population, to the former slaves, of course, that were liberated. There were attempts during Reconstruction to actually integrate them into the national life of the country as well. The process of Reconstruction, of course, that involved not only a series of bills or legislation, but to a certain extent, the Union Army is going to enforce those reforms. Those Reconstruction reforms are going to be enforced by the Union generals that are going to dominate the southern states. We're going to see that, of course, paying attention to what was going on in Texas during this process of Reconstruction, and looking also at the reasons why Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877. So all of that is going to be covered in this sixth topic of the semester. Okay, so let us now turn to our outlines here, so we may begin our discussion on Texas from Civil Wars to Reconstruction, against plural civil wars, as I explained, from 1860 to 1877. Now, first, please understand the main components of this topic. We're going to actually, in the table of contents, it shows that we're going to cover three segments, three specific sections. Something we have been doing, again, in each topic, just kind of going over in the very beginning of the main sections, the main parts. And that provides a blueprint, again, for you to understand, again, how this topic is going to be explained, broke it down, etc. Again, how it's going to be organized. So the first segment that we're going to cover today, hopefully we get to cover the entire first part today, is going to deal with the origins and causes of the Civil War itself. So before we just initiate our discussion in 1860 and just look at the outbreak of the war, we're going to first understand why this war took place. In other words, the reasons, the factors that led to the war. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing here, looking at the origins, the causes of the Civil War. And then in the second part, we're just going to pay attention now to the Civil War itself, looking at Texas. Texas will be joining the Confederacy, the Southern Confederacy, the Southern states, and will fight on the side of the Confederacy throughout the Civil War. And we're going to be paying attention to Texas' participation, again, in the struggle. And the third and final segment is going to deal with Reconstruction itself. Okay, Reconstruction. Texas during Reconstruction, that is to say. So hopefully, again, in the ideal world, each of the three sessions that we're going to present for this topic is going to cover one of those parts in the ideal world. I mean, we're going to actually try to make it possible. So let's begin then with part one, looking at origins and causes of the Civil War. Okay, this is essential because when we study anything in history, whether we're studying, for example, economic downturns like depressions or revolutions or wars, etc., we have to study the origins, the historical background of that, trying to understand causation, causes, in other words, what brings a certain change in society, for example, whether it's radical, rapid change or gradual change, that has to be understood. What exactly brings that change? Okay. And here, what we're going to be doing here is not really, trying to understand all of the causes because there's a multiplicity of factors here that got involved. Okay. The subject matter is really so vast that is not going to be understood in one class or two classes. Sometimes the Civil War can be actually understood in an entire semester in a single course. That's how intricate, that's how complex this subject matter is. So what we're going to be doing here in this particular session is just looking at the general causes, the general origins. Again, this is a general overview that is going to synthesize the most important factors, just the most important. Those are not the only ones, but the most important factors that led to the war. Okay, so let us then proceed with those factors. There's going to be about four factors, again, that I have selected, that those are the most commonly understood, studied, presented by scholars of the Civil War, of this period of time, as to be the most significant ones, of course. So let us understand the first one. The first factor that led to the U.S. Civil War, okay, was a fragmentation, if you will, of the United States that had existed really going back to the beginning of the country back in the colonial period. Okay, the country was fragmented into sections, that is to say. Okay, and there was a northern section and a southern section. This is something that historians commonly refer as sectionalism. Sectionalism, again, is the idea that the United States developed ever since the beginning of the 13 colonies in a very fragmented way. There were two distinct, very different sections or regions that coexisted with one another. They were part of the same system. First, they were part of the British system. There were British colonies. There were the upper colonies and the southern colonies. They were very different. Okay, in culture and society, the economy, where it's radically different. And when those colonies became independent from Great Britain and were integrated into the United States, it's still, we're going to see that even when the United States emerges as an independent country, the upper states and the southern states remain very, very different from one another. Very different regions, very different sections geographical sections, if you will, that were so opposed to one another in many, many ways that what this entailed, it was not just that they were different, but people viewed the country from their own regional lens, that is to say. So if people live in the north, the peoples of the north usually saw the United States through their own, lens. They pretty much believed that the entire country needed to be like the north. Their values, their economic system, the way they organize, etc. Everything, again, their way of thinking, their way of life, that was the way. In other words, this is the best way. This is the ideal way that the country should be, the entire country. And likewise, when you go to the South, people are going to think in that manner as well. They saw the United States through the Southern way of life, through that lens. They believe that their society, that their region, that their culture, that was the culture of the United States that everybody needed to share. This is what the United States should be, in other words. And so each side was trying to shape, if you will, the country according to their own values, according to their own system of thought, again, their own culture. So there's going to be sectional division, sectional competition as well, because what we're going to see is that each of those sections were simply competing, again, to determine which of the two cultures, which of the two ways of life were going to dominate, in other words. Okay, so there's going to be competition, particularly in the decades before the Civil War. This competition does not necessarily exist in the very beginning of the colonies, but over time, as the colonies became independent and they formed states and become part of the United States, we're going to see that there was the sense of competition and rivalry between the upper states and the southern states, but this sense of competition and rivalry is going to intensify and accelerate as we move into the 1830s and beyond. Just 3 decades before the Civil War breaks out in 1860, we're going to see that those two sections are really growing apart. Okay, there's intense, tensions, there's competition, there's rivalry, and of course, there's going to be a breaking point in 1860. So let us then look at that development, okay? The development of sectionalism, if you will, okay? It went through stages, how the country was divided between two different systems of thought, different economic systems, particularly, ever since the beginning. And one way to understand, again, this is just one way to understand those divisions, the divisions in the North and the South, those sectional divisions, is through economics. Okay, economics is really one very simple way one can understand differences in societies. For example, there's so many kinds of societies around the world, and one way to understand those differences is through economics. It's not the only way, but economics is pretty much very helpful to understand how people see the world, how they organize themselves, etc., through their economic system. So the North, ever since the very start, again, of the British colonies back in the 1600s, this is the region that developed the system that will, over time, becomes known as capitalism, for example. So this is going to be the section that is going to give rise to capitalism again, the capitalist North, if you will. In the South, the economic system that had existed ever since the very, very start of the colonies back in the 1600s, implemented a very different system that pretty much remained constant across the colonial period and the national period, all the way to the Civil War. And this system was not capitalism, it was actually feudalism. Okay, so this is going to be the way we can begin to understand those sectional differences, those sectional divisions in the United States by looking again at economics. Okay, so we're talking about capitalism, for example, taking root very early on in the North, and feudalism taking root very early on in the South. So now that we have this understanding, of course, this map shows you the states in blue were the capitalist ones, again, in 1860 at the outset of the Civil War. And the feudal states were the southern states, okay, colored red. Again, those were the feudal states. So now that we have understood that just in very general terms, now let's go to the specifics. Let's look at the historical divisions between the North and the South, looking at the development of capitalism in the North and feudalism in the South. Again, so we have to take a glance. We have to take a glance as far back as possible, again, looking at the colonial period when the two sections were formed. And back in the 1600s, from 1609, let us just start there, the beginning of Jamestown, for example, in Virginia. Okay. From that point onwards, all across the colonial period, all the way to independence itself, 1783, this is when independence was finally gained. The entire colonial period, we're going to see the formation of two different regional economies in the colonial period. Again, one was feudal in the South, and the other one was sort of proto-capitalist, if you will, in the North. That is going to lead to capitalism, if you will, okay, in the North. All right, so let us look then at this emergence of two different regional economies back in the colonial period. So let's start with the South, okay? The southern colonies. So when we mean about the southern colonies, we talk about, for example, Virginia, the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. Those will become the southern colonies, okay, the lower colonies as they were called. Those lower colonies operated under a totally different economic system that the British implemented, of course, as a result of being geographically located in lands that were very, very primed for cash crop agriculture. Cash crop agriculture, okay? That is to say, this is a kind of warm environment, warm climate, warmer, again, compared to the North. The winters are shorter than in the North. And we got, of course, plenty of rain. The soil is pretty fertile and so on. So geographically speaking, this was going to be, a region that is going to produce cash crops, again, for the British Empire. So therefore, the economic enterprise that the British established here in the southern colonies precisely to produce those cash crops was the plantation. Okay, the plantation itself. We're going to see a series of plantations established in those colonies, in the southern colonies, and that was the most important unit of production. This is the most important economic unit, period. Okay, this is the main enterprise, again, of the southern colonies, the plantation itself. Okay, this is where planters are growing cash crops for exports, cash crops that are being exported all over the world by the British that, were very valuable in the world market. Those were precious goods, commodities that people demanded in Europe, in Africa, and elsewhere. And the British were trading them, of course, like tobacco, for example. Okay, the plantations were generating tobacco. They were generating rice, particularly tobacco and rice, and later on, much, much later, okay, we're going to see the introduction of sugar. Again, this is not something that starts right away. Sugar is going to be developed quite later, again, in later stages. But it was initially tobacco and rice. Again, what those colonies were producing, particularly and primarily. Again, so again, this is going to be the kind of economic system, again, that is going to take root ever since the beginning of the 13 colonies in the South. Again, it's pretty much an agricultural economy. It's a cash crop agriculture, it's called. and the enterprises that are really in producing those products for exports for those colonies are, again, plantations. So this is a plantation economy, that is to say, per excellence. Okay, this is a plantation economy in which the societies, again, of the colonies are going to be settled by planters. Those are the owners of the plantations. So this is, again, the most important social group because it owns, again, the planters, they own, of course, the most important unit of production, the plantation. They're the ones generating those exports, the cash crops. And of course, we cannot really understand a plantation without understanding the system of labor that comes with it. Okay. Back during this time, again, plantations all over the Americas were worked by slaves. Okay, the slaves was the main workforce. This is the system of labor that the plantations operated under. Okay, so the workforce, the people that are really growing the tobacco, the rice, etc. Again, for the British are going to be growing sugar also in the Caribbean islands as well. They're going to have plantations in places like Jamaica, for example, Barbados. The workforce, again, of those plantations were slaves. Okay, so that's the labor system that comes with the plantation. Okay, so likewise, we're going to see the introduction of slavery in the southern colonies as well. This is, again, another social group that is going to be also very much present in southern society. And at the same time, we're going to see yet another social group, small farmers as well. Okay, there were people that were not necessarily planters, that did not own those large enterprises. Many of them came in as indentured servants from England and served for a period of years, paid off their debts. They were freed and they were given some land, again, so they can actually produce their own food, so they can grow their own food, sustain their families. So we're also going to see a third group of people in the South, of course, and those were the small farmers. That's very important, again. So this is really the kind of society that is going to take root in the southern colonies. Again, it's an agricultural economy in which we see the plantation itself as the most productive enterprise. And this is run and operated by planters through a system of labor. Of course, it's called slavery. So we're going to see also the presence of African slaves. And of course, a third group is going to also coexist in those colonies as small farmers. And so this is what we refer as feudalism. Because under feudalism, again, the economic system that is known as feudalism is one in which there's, again, two groups involved, again, in the generation of goods, in the generation of wealth. One is the landowners. Okay, the landowners is one group. They are the owners of the land. They're the owners of the enterprise. For example, in this case, we're talking about plantations. They're the ones that are administering and operating the plantation. And the workforce under feudalism is composed of serfs. It's composed of servants, or they're composed of slaves, again, and they pay tribute to the landlord in the form of labor. Okay, they labor for the landlord, and this is how the economy works under feudalism. Again, there's landlords that own the land and the enterprise, if you will, and the people that pay tribute, whether they're serfs or servants or slaves, they're actually providing tribute to the landlord in the form of labor in order to produce the wealth, to produce the products that needs to be produced. This is how things work. And most of the work, by the way, that needs to be done in society, even outside of agriculture, like building roads, clearing land, or building homes, etc., is also done by serfs or slaves or servants. as a form of tribute. In other words, they are commissioned also to engage in building in public works, like, for example, building communities, building bars, warehouses, etc. Okay, so that's feudalism. Okay, that is what feudalism is. And this is going to be a feudal economy with a feudal society, the South, that is to say. Okay, so this is very important. The Southern colonies are going to pretty much stay that way, okay, all throughout not only the colonial period, but even into the national period. Southern society is not going to change very much, okay? It's going to stay structured that way, okay? Planters, slaves, and small farmers, and it's cash crop agriculture. That is the system. Again, that gives the South its purpose, its energy, its life, okay? Cash crop agriculture. The upper colonies, however, the upper region that the British colonized is going to be totally different, okay? So in what way? Okay, in what way is the upper colonies are going to be totally different? Well, the upper colonies, the British realized that you cannot really establish plantations there, okay? No, you cannot, because the climate, again, does not allow for the growth of tobacco, for the growth of rice, for example, or those very precious, valuable agricultural commodities, again, like sugar, etc. It's impossible because those plants require a more tropical, subtropical climate to develop and grow. So therefore, the British in the upper colonies established a series of colonies to actually use those colonies to produce products for exports, that is to say, trading goods, okay? Whether it's a fur trade, for example, lumber, fish, okay? Those products, again, that the colonies were to export to the mother country, okay? Not agricultural products per se, but rather, again, furs, timber, okay? Very important, fish, etc. Okay, so those colonies are not necessarily going to be plantation colonies. They're going to be colonies engaged in commerce and trade. Okay, commerce and trade is going to be the dominant economic system of the upper colonies, or commercial economies and trading economies as well. What people are doing is they're trying to generate products for export, that is to say, reaching out to the Native Americans, trading European products for furs, and trying to export those furs overseas, or lumber and the like. Again, so this is what the northern colonies are going to be doing, precisely because the climate does not allow, again, the establishment of plantations. And there's another factor that is going to shape the northern societies, again, very different from the southern societies as well, and that is that the upper colonies, particularly New England and Pennsylvania, were settled by religious communities like the Puritans and the Quakers. Okay, the Puritans in New England, the Quakers in Pennsylvania. And so this is a different settlement pattern, from the South. In the South was not settled necessarily by religious communities that wanted to be, establishing their religious, societies, etc., to practice their religion in freedom. And in the upper colonies, we're going to see that. Again, the Puritans and the Quakers wanted to establish societies for them to practice their religion in total freedom. And they were also very well known to introduce specific ideas and values, those two groups, the Puritan and the Quakers, that are going to shape the culture of the North. Okay, for example, the Puritans introduce capitalism. It's called the spirit of capitalism, again, to New England. They had this belief that prosperity was a sign of the blessing of God, and that economic well-being, economic prosperity was also a sign of salvation, that those that were going to heaven, those that were chosen to go to heaven, were those that had the most economic success. So, of course, if the Puritans believed that, They, in New England, what they're going to do is work very diligently. They're going to work every day, in a very disciplined manner in order to create prosperity for themselves, for their families, for their communities. And they really wanted to create an affluent society, engaged in trade, create enterprises, create work that will allow people to build up, again, wealth and social status. In other words, because that social status and wealth was a sign, again, of salvation. So this is going to be the root, if you will, of capitalism in the North. This is one of the reasons why capitalism is going to flourish in the North. And the Quakers introduced the idea of abolitionism, the idea that they believe that, enslaving another human being was enslaving a part of God, because God exists in each one of us, is present in our hearts. So the Quakers, because they believed that, they were the first ones, again, to introduce laws to abolish slavery in Pennsylvania, for example. It is the first colony really to move towards abolitionism, and Pennsylvania is going to be the home of abolitionism as well, to abolish slavery. Abolitionist societies, abolitionist activists, writers, speakers, a great many of them came from Pennsylvania as a result of this Quaker influence, if you will. So again, this is very, very important. And again, the upper colonies, because they're now operating on a commercial and trading economic system, and because the people that come over are religious groups that reject slavery from the start, and they want to create affluence, they want to create enterprises so they can create a very prosperous societies. We're going to see that those upper colonies, particularly Pennsylvania and New England, are going to be colonies that are going to be very, very diligent in trying to engage in commerce and trade, exporting furs, fish, timber, also some grain. And we're going to see a multiplicity of different social groups, okay, as well. Society is going to be very, very diverse, economically speaking, because we're going to see, for example, farmers, traders, there's going to be artisans, manufacturers, there's going to be different kinds of trades and work and social occupations, if you will, many social groupings, each involved in different economic activities. So this is going to be the very, very early rise, if you will, of a capitalist society in which we're going to see not just planters and slaves, but rather there's going to be a multiplicity of different, again, groups engaged in many kinds of enterprise. In other words, whether they're, again, engaged in exporting fish, for example, there's fishing industries, there's people, in the lumber industries, there's in the fur trade, there's manufacturers, people, again, manufacturing shoes or clothes, etc. Again, very, very diverse, if you will. And the upper colonies are also going to export just a very small amount of African slaves. They were importing some African slaves, but it was so limited because there was no need for them. There's no plantations in the North, and also because there's a certain rejection of that institution by the religious communities that I just mentioned. So most of the African slaves are going to actually go to the South. Again, the bulk of the African slaves are going to go to the South. All right, so the colonial period itself is just laying out the groundwork, if you will, for future divisions, because we see that those colonies were shaped very differently from the beginning. They operated economically very different. They were settled very differently, by the British. And so we see social divisions, we see economic divisions, and again, there are going to be also very serious cultural divisions as well in the North and the South. Then we see, of course, that those divisions increase in the national period once we see the process of independence unfolding and the colonies getting independence. We see the formation of the United States in 1787, the American Republic. From the formation of the American Republic in 1787, all the way to the eve of the Civil War in 1860, we're going to see that in that period of time, it's called the national period, the early national period. We're going to see the rise of two economic systems now, again, during the national period. That is to say that it's not just that there's regional differences because the upper, settlers and the southern settlers are conducting different economic activities, but rather with the formation of the United States, instead of the United States having a single economic system in which all of the states, were operating under, simultaneously in the same system, the United States emerges with two economic systems, one that was operating independently in the north, and the other one is going to be operating independently in the south. Okay, so during those years, the United States had two economic systems, side by side, if you will. So again, there's going to be increasing economic divisions, again, taking root. So let us now look at those economic divisions, if you will, because it's very important to understand the coming of the Civil War, again, by understanding how the North and the South will become increasingly divided, particularly after independence. In the national period, we're going to see that those two sections, the North and the South, are going to grow apart, particularly because they're pretty much developing two very different economic systems. For example, in the North, we mentioned that the elements are present already, in the colonial period, that will foster the rise of a capitalist society. For example, a society geared, towards, for example, commerce. There's the rise of different enterprises. For example, there's the idea of prosperity. And it's a religious idea of the Puritans believing in prosperity as the blessing of God, etc. There's a multiplicity of different occupations, etc., that people are carrying out. And there's trade, there's exports, etc. So this is very important because those elements are going to help actually give rise in the North in the early years of nationhood to an economic system that is known as industrial capitalism. Now we're going to see the rise of what is called industrial capitalism. Again, this came with the first industrial revolution in the United States. When the United States is beginning industrialization in 1816, this is the first wave of industrialization. It starts in 1816 all the way to 1860. It's called the first industrial revolution that took root in the North. Okay, so it is true, the United States is beginning to industrialize, but not the entire country is industrializing, only the northern states, particularly the northeastern states, okay, like New England, for example, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, particularly those. We're going to see, again, the rise of industrial capitalism with the introduction of what is called the factory system and a new system of labor that capitalism introduced. And that new system of labor is called wage labor. Okay, wage labor. So there's going to be a new kind of enterprise that capitalism introduced, industrial capitalism, which is the factory itself. Okay, so this is something that, of course, has started in England. Actually, the Industrial Revolution it actually starts in England in 1750 with the rise of the factory system. England is indeed the very first country to industrialize, and the United States was the second country to industrialize, but it's only industrializing in the upper states that I just mentioned. And again, this Industrial Revolution was called an industrial revolution, particularly again because it introduced a new form of enterprise, and that is the factory itself. Okay, there's going to be new machines, machinery like weaving machines that people are operating in order to, for example, manufacture clothing. And there's also going to be in the production of steel as well, in iron works during the Industrial Revolution. That also required the assistance of people, workers, if you will, in the manufacturing of steel and iron. And also, of course, mining as well, the mining of the iron ore and coal, etc. But what's most important, again, to note is that how people are going to earn their living, again, in this new kind of system. A new kind of economic system called industrial capitalism is that the people working in those factories, the people working in those industrial plants are going to earn wages. They're going to be hired on a permanent basis there to perform a certain task. And at the end of the week or the end of the month, depending again, they're going to be paid again for their labor. Again, so this is going to be a new economy again on the rise, in which the way people are going to organize themselves is by actually organizing themselves around the payment of wages. So everything that needs to be done, every kind of work that needs to be done, people are going to hire somebody to do it. Again, and people are going to get paid for their labor. That is what's called wage labor. If a factory needs workers, well, they're going to hire people to work in the factories. If industrial plants, again, will need workers or miners, etc., people are going to get paid for their labor. If you need to build a house, for example, you're going to hire, an engineer, and you're going to pay that engineer, who in turn is going to pay workers again to help them in building the house. So everything that needs to be done in society, any kind of work, okay, building roads or, producing food or working in industries for the production of products or clothing, everything that needs to be done, people are going to be paid for their labor, a wage or a salary, etc. Again, so it's a new way of organizing society. Society is being reorganized again in a whole different way. And one of the most important units of production, the most important economic unit itself, again, is the factory. The factory itself, again, is the most productive, again, enterprise. So the Industrial Revolution that started in England in 1750, and is going to come to the United States in 1816. The United States was the second country to move towards industrialization. Those two regions, England and the United States, created, again, this phenomenon called industrial capitalism, when we're going to see the introduction, again, of certain enterprises. Those are going to be the capitalist enterprises, industrial capitalist enterprises that are going to dominate the economy of England. And in this case, they're going to dominate the economy of the North, okay, of the United States. And that is textile factories. Those are the factories that were manufacturing clothing, okay, textiles, in other words. There's now spinning machines, weaving machines, and people are now engaged in mass production, because now with those machines, we're going to see that, people can actually manufacture clothing much, much easier and faster than it was done by hand, okay, in the past. So again, textile factories, okay, first and foremost, this is going to be the new economic enterprise of industrial capitalism. And of course, there's going to be people moving into those factories, working there for wages. They're earning their living, through the payment of wages. This is the kind of work that people are going to now engage in, in industrial societies like at this time, England and in the north part of the United States. The other enterprise is mining. It was essential to mine for iron ore and coal, because we're going to see also the production of steel, for example. in order to build machines, in order to build factories, etc., it was necessary to extract the iron ore, smelt it, and with that, of course, engage in the production of everything that industry required, that requires iron or requires steel. So there's going to be also, of course, mining industries, mining coal, mining iron ore. And there's going to be, of course, steel plants or steel industries. This is the industry that is smelting the iron ore and is manufacturing, again, the machines, the railroads. There's going to be railroad constructions, etc., locomotives, wagons, and the like. Again, so there's steel plants, if you will. Those are the three main important economic enterprises of the first industrial revolution. And we see the presence, the rise of those enterprises in the Northeast, particularly of the United States. Okay, in the Northeast, we're going to see the rise of textile factories propping up all over New England, for example, parts of New Jersey as well, Rhode Island. Okay. We're going to see mining and steel plants as well in Pennsylvania and the like. Again, we're going to see, of course, mining operations in New Jersey. Again, all of the Northeast is going to be moving towards now this new system. Okay, whether we're going to call it the factory system or industries, this is on the rise. And how people earn their living there, they work there on a permanent basis. They earn wages, of course. So what we're going to see in the North, particularly, is the rise of large industrial cities, because where those enterprises were located, where the textile factories, mining, industries, and steel plants, what we're going to see is that they attracted thousands and thousands of farmers to those centers in order to be hired there to perform, again, those jobs. They're going to be now working for wages. So again, this really increased the size of settlements, again, from little towns now to large industrial cities. And we're going to see the presence of social classes, of course. The Industrial Revolution also gave rise to social classes, because we're going to see that those that operated the machines or were working in the mines, etc., they're going to become part of the industrial working class, the industrial workers, if you will. But those that were administering those industries, those that were keeping the books, for example, the engineers that were providing maintenance, fixing the machines or inventing new ones, the scientists, all of them are going to be hired, and they're going to be paid higher wages for their knowledge, their skills, if you will, because they're educated, they were trained, etc. They're going to be paid higher wages, and they're going to be part of a growing middle class. Again, we're not going to see a large middle class, of course, at this time in the United States, but the early rise of the middle class is beginning again with the rise of the professional and managers, the supervisors, the engineers, etc. again. So the North is going to be changing, and it's going to be changing very steadily, because it's industrializing, is reorganizing society altogether by introducing new economic enterprises, like factories, industrial plants, and mining, and also paying people wages. Okay, it's a wage labor system. Okay, and we're going to see, of course, society changing, because we're going to see cities growing. They're becoming larger and larger, more populated, and we're going to see, of course, social classes as well. Okay, as well. All right, so another issue to contemplate here is transportation itself. The Industrial Revolution also brought about a revolution in transportation, a transportation revolution, of course, something that the British initiated, again, with the introduction of steamboats and railroads. Okay, railroads came with the Industrial Revolution. It was necessary to transport all the heavy materials, like the coal, for example, the iron ore, the steel, and all the manufactured products needed to be carried in industrial-sized machinery. So they invented, of course, steamboats and railroads precisely to manage that heavy-duty transportation. And so we can see for a revolution in transportation in England, that is also going to come into the United States as well. In the North is undergoing a very, very visible change in transportation technology when we see the introduction of steamboats and railroads, navigation systems, for example. A series of canals were built across the northern states, again, in order to allow the steamboats to be moving back and forth across the northern states, from New England, from New York, all the way to the Great Lakes, okay, all the way to present day, for example, Chicago. All of this region is going to be interconnected by a series of canals that are going to be moving manufactured goods, grain, for example. They're going to be moving people as well, of course, all across the north. So it's modernizing, if you will. Now, the Erie Canal is the one that was actually in the project, again, to build those series of canals. It started in 1825 and, unfolded for a couple of decades, again, into the 1850s and 60s. And the railroad, of course, we're going to see a railroad revolution as well. Very significant, okay, that we're going to see that the railroad is beginning to create a revolution in the United States in the 1830s. So from the 1830s to the 1850s, we're going to see a railroad revolution in the United States that was far more important, more all-encompassing, if you will, in the northern states, more so than in the South. And it was precisely the Pennsylvania Railroad, this company, that was engaged in this massive undertaking, of building a railroad all across the northern states, hoping that it could also go to the South. But again, the Pennsylvania Railroad is not going to have access in the southern states. Of course, there was a resistance again in the South to allow the Pennsylvania Railroad to build the rail lines. So in the North, 22,000 miles of tracks were built, again, by the Pennsylvania Railroad, interconnecting all of the states, again, of the North through the system of railways that are going to now become far more integrated economically. So that is the idea, that you want to integrate, okay, the upper states economically so they can function as a single unit. So, for example, if there are farmers in the Ohio Valley growing grain, this was the breadbasket of the United States, the Ohio Valley. It was essential that the new industrial cities on the rise in the eastern seaboard, in places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, for example, that it was necessary to feed the people of the cities because they were growing in population. And so how are you going to transport all this grain, wheat, corn, vegetables, etc., to the cities to feed people? So the system of transportation, again, particularly the railroad, is going to help facilitate the transfer of food from the Ohio Valley, again, in the Great Lakes region, to the Northeast, and likewise, again, manufacture products that the farmers require, like, for example, equipment, tools for farming, fertilizers, barbed wire, and the like, that the farmers require for agriculture that were manufactured in the Northeast are going to also be shipped to the Midwest, which is the Ohio Valley, of course, which is the breadbasket, again, in the United States. So once again, this is going to integrate the upper states together economically. There's going to be an alliance between manufacturers in the Northeast and farmers in the Midwest. And they're going to come together again, economically speaking, because they both needed each other. The food was needed in the Northeast, and the agricultural technologies, the equipment was needed in the Midwest. And again, the railroads served to integrate, again, those two sections together. And again, we're going to see the North really operating under what is called industrial capitalism. Now, the South is not going to industrialize. Okay, so we're not going to see a massive program implemented in the South for giving rise to factories and industrial plants, for steel production, etc. There were very few factories present in the South. There were some. There's not to deny that there were none, but we're not going to see the industrialization again of the southern states. The southern states will continue with their old economic system of plantation agriculture. Plantation agriculture will remain, pretty much the same in this process, with the social structures again that we talked about, a few moments ago, in which we find, particularly in the South, the planters dominating the plantations. This is the most important economic enterprise, and the slaves dominating the work done in the agricultural fields, in the plantations, but also in other types of work like construction work, etc. And of course, the small farmers as well. They're still going to remain. So the society of the South will remain pretty much traditional. It's going to, remain the same, static, frozen in time. And the reason for that is because what Southern planters realize is that the Industrial Revolution required a crop that only they could produce in such a massive scale that they decided that instead of industrializing and building factories, what we're going to do is simply invest all our energies, all our capital in the expansion of plantations, because what the Industrial Revolution required to manufacture the clothing is cotton. Okay, there was an insatiable appetite, again, an insatiable demand for cotton, both in England, again, because England is also again engaged in industrialization, textile manufacturing, and in the upper states of the United States that require cotton to manufacture clothing. So what Southern planters are going to say is, who's going to grow it? Okay, so who's going to grow the cotton? So what they said is, we are. Okay, so they decided that instead of building factories, they were simply going to expand again the cotton agriculture. That is to say, it is going to be a shift towards a cotton economy, and cotton will become king in the South. And there's the rise of king cotton. This is the most important crop of the South. This is the most valuable, the most precious. This is what is going to give the South its prominence, its wealth, in other words, because it was so valuable for the growing industries that people were paying gold for them, in other words. So there was a no-brainer, from their perspective. Look, we just have to move towards cotton. Those were still operating under tobacco and rice. They're going to make a shift towards cotton in many cases. Okay, and we're going to see cotton agriculture skyrocketing in the U.S. South, particularly when the Industrial Revolution is taking place in England, and later on, of course, by 1816 in the United States, from 1,000 tons in 1790. This is what the South was producing. In 1790, it was only 1,000 tons to 1 million by 1860. By 1860, the South was really now producing 1 million tons. So this difference from 1,000 to 1 million was due precisely to the growing demand by year. Again, the Industrial Revolution simply demands more and more quantities, again, of this crop. So what we're going to see is that planters are moving westward because there's a growing demand for cotton. So they want to move westward, clear more land in order to establish more and more cotton plantations. Okay, and so from the original 4 plantation states, again, those were the original 4 plantation colonies: Virginia, South, North Carolina, and Georgia. We're going to see a massive expansion westward in the South that is going to bring in additional states into the Union as plantation states as well. So again, those are the original 4: Virginia, North, South Carolina, and Georgia.
Those were the original colonies that were the plantation colonies that we spoke about. But now there's an industrial revolution, and of course, there's going to be a massive expansion westward. Okay, starting around 1803, we're going to see that planters are simply trying to move as quickly as possible to the western frontier in order to develop more and more cotton plantations, because this is the kind of enterprise that they need. We need more enterprises. We need more plantations to grow cotton. And they will add an additional eight more states across the West, that all of them, without exception, are going to be plantation states. That is to say, in which the plantation itself will be the most productive enterprise, and cotton agriculture, cotton exports will become the main source of revenue and wealth, not only for the planter class, but for their states as well. Okay, so Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, and of course, Texas as well. Okay, so by 1860, again, they form a bloc in which was really what brought them together is that they were all agricultural states. They had an agricultural economy in which the plantation itself was the most productive enterprise, and cotton was the main source of revenue that sustained their economies. Okay, they exported the vast majority of this cotton to England. So the vast majority, again, 75% of the entire cotton production of the entire South was actually exported to England, and only 25% ended up in the upper states, in places like, for example, New York, New Jersey, New England, etc., for textile manufacturing. But what it's revealing is that the South is going to become increasingly dependent on a single crop. Okay, that cotton was the only crop that the southern states preferred, and this is the only thing that they care about. And they based all of their southern economies and the entire financial system of the South depended on a single crop. So again, this is going to be, a very short-sighted, again, type of decision, because what happens when, cotton prices fall, for example? Okay, when the cotton market is affected, etc. Of course, their entire economy is going to suffer as a result of that, because they're basing their entire economic revenues and economic finances to finance their states, etc. On cotton exports. Okay, so this is going to be something that will affect them, of course, as we'll see. But they're not just going to grow dependent on plantation agriculture and cotton production, but also on the system of labor that came with it as well. Okay, that is, of course, slavery itself. So there's going to be also a growing dependency on slavery, because this is, again, the labor system of the plantation economy. So from 1793 to 1860, as the industries demanded more cotton and they were expanding westward, the southern planters, to clear more land and the like, they also demanded more labor, in this case, more slave labor. And we're going to see a sharp increase also in the slave population in the southern states, from 700,000 in 1793 to 4.5 million in 1860. So there's going to be a sharp increase that was, that corresponded particularly, again, with the increase of the plantation system across the West. We're going to see that from this population, about 1 million, again, of those slaves migrated from the eastern seaboard to the west. Those were slaves that lived in places like Virginia, Carolina, etc. That planters actually transferred to the western states in order to, again, grow the cotton again. So by 1860, a third of the population of the South were slaves. This is very important, that a third of the entire population of the South were slaves again. So there's going to be this group again that I mentioned in the beginning that is going to be very important in the production of the crop that is sustaining the Southern economy, by the way. So this is something that Southern slaveholders, Southern planters are not going to simply give up that easily, again, because they depended on it. Of course, they considered slaves as a form of capital, property. That is to say, slaves were indeed considered capital or property, and there were legal frameworks in the Southern Constitution that indicated exactly that they were considered property. Like, for example, the master had the right to the labor of the slave itself. This is again what is valuable about the slave is the labor it provides. Again, to the master itself. And the master, of course, for the most part, needed the slaves in order to grow the cotton. 70% of the slaves in the South are growing cotton. They're engaged in agricultural work. 70% are in the fields. But like I said, there's also work that needs to be done. There's also work like construction work, building homes, repairs, etc., gardening, cooking, etc. Even some medicine. There's also, people providing medical attention and the like. Building roads, you name it. All of those jobs, again, were in the hands also of the slaves because they needed to provide, of course, that service to the master as well. Okay, there's called menial occupations. 30%, again, were engaged in what's called menial occupations. And according to the South, slave labor itself was the basis of wealth and credit. In other words, in order to obtain credit in the South, you needed to have slaves in order to borrow money. In order for a bank to actually loan you money, you needed to have slaves as security. To secure the loan, that is to say, you needed to have slaves. And how people were measured in terms of their wealth, it was not necessarily about land, even though land is important. People that were considered wealthy, were those that owned most slaves, that is to say, even if they did not own any land, but the slaves really were used to generate wealth because you can always rent, for example, your slaves to somebody that needed to do work, and you'll be collecting rent. You'll be collecting monies again. So it is the labor that is valuable. The labor itself is the most valuable asset in the South, of course. All right. So in Texas itself, slavery was the backbone of the entire economy of Texas. It was also, again, considered the source of wealth. What was really, making an individual, stand out and be prominent in society economically, to be wealthy was, the number of slaves that they owned. There were people that owned 30 slaves. Again, you had a plantation, for example, a mid-size, and they were rare, but there were some that actually owned about 100. Those were rare. Those that owned about 100, of course, were considered very, very wealthy, by the way. So it was an average between 30 and 100, but more than likely, again, the average slaveholder was, owning about 30 in a cotton plantation, that is to say. And only about 3% of the population in Texas, as well as in the other slave states, own slaves. Okay, 3%. Okay, so this is a small number of people that could afford actually to own the slaves. So once again, it was the backbone of the Texas economy because it was really cotton production again and the exports that were the ones that were bringing revenues into the state. Okay, so if Texas received monies coming from the outside, again, 75% of the cotton is shipped to England. So if there's going to be capital flowing in, revenues flowing into the state is because of the exports, and the bulk of the exports is cotton itself. Okay, so the state depends on this crop to sustain its finances. Okay, so this is again something that has to be understood, particularly leading to the decision of Texas to join the Confederacy and secede from the Union and participate in the Civil War, because again, slavery was the backbone of the entire Texas economy. People also received revenues from rented labor, as I explained. You might own slaves, but not own land, but you're simply renting out your labor to somebody that wants to do certain tasks, and they'll pay you. In other words, it's the labor that is valuable. Also, again, in the financial system of the entire South, in Texas as well, collateral. Slaves are seen as collateral for long-term and short-term loans. If you needed quick cash, you simply take, your property title of your slave, to a loan officer, etc., and they will loan you the money very quickly by saying, okay, look, if I don't pay you back, here it is. There's a property title. I have a slave or two, etc., something like that. Okay, or long-term as well, monies that you needed for investment. Again, if you need to buy land, if you needed to, in a business venture, for example, invest in an enterprise, etc., build a cotton plantation and the like. If you had slaves, that will facilitate finance. In other words, a bank will actually loan you money for those business ventures. And also, it was used as currency to pay off debts. If you had a pending debt, but you did not have the cash, you can always just transfer your slaves to that person and clear that debt. It was, considered as currency, if you will. Or you can exchange your slaves for land. If you wanted to buy land, you did not have any cash, but you happen to have some slaves, you can actually just transfer that for land as well. It was exchangeable, if you will, for land. This is in Texas again. So it's going to become slavery is going to be central to the economy of Texas. It's going to sustain the economy, the business transactions, again, of individuals and the like. Whenever they're investing, whether they're buying or transferring assets, etc. Again, it was so key. It was the labor again. So we have to understand it as such. Now, of course, with those differences, an industrial capitalist North with their factories and their industrial plants and their mines and their wage labor economy, and an agricultural South still totally centered on the plantation economy, in which the plantation is the most important economic unit, the most productive, and slavery is so central. This a system of labor that is allowing the functioning of the plantation in the Southern economy, and even the financial system, again, of the entire South will be based on slavery as well. So what we see is that there's going to be two economic systems that are going to compete in the United States starting around 1830. Again, this competition begins roughly, you can see it, by 1830, that the two economic systems, industrial capitalism and plantation agriculture, are beginning to, again, compete with one another over the issue of particularly which is going to be dominant. In other words, which of those two economic systems is going to be dominant over the other. Okay, so they're beginning to compete, if you will. And this competition, of course, was seen in certain conflicts, if you will. There are conflicts that there's now in competition, okay, in the United States between two different economic systems. And one is, again, the conflict over tariffs. So what is the conflict over tariffs? Okay, so what is this? So a tariff is simply a tax on imports. Okay, that's what a tariff is, that you have to tax imported goods. So whenever you're beginning to import, or you're attempting to import a product from overseas, that you have to tax it in order to, one, raise revenues. Okay, the state must raise revenues for those import duties. But also, the idea is that you have to also tax it because you want the people in your country to purchase the national product. In other words, instead of buying it from foreign producers, that you want to incentivize people to actually buy it from producers at home. So if you tax a product coming from other countries, it's going to become more expensive when it comes in other words. So this is going to be a conflict that is going to divide, again, the North and the South, because the North, the industrial North, wants Americans to buy manufactured products from American companies, that is to say. So the British, some people desire to import products from Great Britain, manufactured products, but in northern industry see that this is going to affect the interest of the North. Again, the factories of the North. And we see that again in 1828 when members of Congress passed the tariffs of 1828, imposing a 50% increase in taxes for all the products coming into the United States, like woolen products, cotton textiles, agricultural products like tea and sugar, most of which were actually imported by the South. The southern states insist, they're adamant, again, in importing products from the British particularly, okay? They want to buy clothing, they want to buy, products coming from China, etc., that the British bring, and they don't want to pay any, again, export or import, in this case, import duties. They don't, okay? The South feels that those tariffs are going to force the people of the South to buy products from the North. And they just don't want to buy American-made products. They want to buy foreign-made, in other words. And so this situation is going to lead to a crisis. It's called the South Carolina Nullification Crisis of 1832, when South Carolina actually threatened to secede from the Union, saying that we don't want to pay those import duties, and we're not going to actually obey that law, the tariffs of 1828, and we're simply going to continue, importing those products from overseas, not paying any taxes, and if we're forced to pay those taxes, we'll simply secede from the Union. So this revealed that there's competition, again, between industrial capitalist states in the North and the southern states over the issue of import duties. Again, so it revealed that there's already tensions building up. And of course, the other source is the conflict over the labor system itself. Okay, the system of labor in the North is based on wage labor, and the system of the South is based on slave labor. And there's already, again, a debate, a national debate over which of the two systems have to go. One has to be the dominant one, and the other one has to be abolished. Northerners insist that slavery needs to be abolished because they say wage labor is much better. Okay, we need jobs for people to do work and get paid, and slavery is preventing that. They say, slavery prevents the creation of jobs, because why would you pay somebody a wage when you can actually have a slave to do that for free? So what Northerners believe is that slave labor actually kills jobs. It hinders job creation. There's millions of people that could be earning wages, and they're not, because people are simply using slaves to do that work, in other words. Okay? So they oppose, again, slave labor, and also because slavery also hinders consumption. If slaves don't earn any wages, because they're doing everything for free, so therefore they're not buying anything, and so they're not really helping fostering, the creation of enterprises and jobs in the United States, because look, the economy is not going to grow when you have slavery, because slaves do not participate in a consumer economy. They're not consuming anything. But if you free them and you pay them a wage, they're going to use those wages to buy things. And so more businesses will be created again, and more people will be hired to operate those businesses, and the economy will grow, again, through economics, in other words. And Southerners, of course, opposed the abolition of slavery. On certain grounds, they cling to this system of labor. They did not want to free the slaves. They did not want to move into a wage labor economy, because Southerners, the slave owners, of course, were the recipients, if you will, of capital. Okay, this is generating capital. In other words, look, my cotton plantation is really generating wealth here. We're generating capital. In other words, the slaves are also a form of capital, and the entire Southern economy is sustained with this system. If we have wealth, if we have capital, if we have economic production, if we have exports, it's because of the system of labor. And if you simply take it away, they said that would be a violation of property rights. Okay, you're going to violate my property rights. So we have a right to this property because they are a form of property, the slaves, which in turn are generating more and more capital for the state. Again, like, for example, you want to borrow money, you want to invest it. If you want to rent your slaves and receive monies, they see all of that as capital as well. So planters really interpret slavery as a form of capital. Okay, it's so strange, to really see a feudal system of servitude through capitalist terms, because this is not capitalism. Capitalism is based on the idea of wage labor. That's is the hallmark of capitalism, is when people are producing what needs to be produced in society through the payment of wages. It's wage labor. But here they see that slavery is simply, a form of capital as well. It's property rights, in other words. And also the ones that did not own any slaves, again, there were people that did not own any slaves. The bulk of the Southern population did not own any slaves, are going to side with the planters in the South. The small farmers, what they call the poor whites, also refused to abolish slavery, because they saw that if that happened, okay, if slavery was simply, abolished and millions of people will be freed, that they felt that they were now to compete in a wage labor or free labor economy with the freed population, again, with the blacks, in other words. So they, even though they did not have any investments in slavery, they did not own any slaves, they did not really want, again, to abolish slavery, because they felt that there's only a certain amount of jobs, okay, in the economy. But if you free the slaves, then there's going to be an intense competition for those limited jobs between the poor whites and, of course, the blacks, and they just didn't want to go through that, of course. So they're going to make an alliance, if you will, with the planters, and this is going to be, of course, very visible here. Is, again, the alliance, that are going to now be on the rise. From 1830 to 1860, we're going to see an alliance, again, of Southern planters, okay, with small farmers in the South. They're going to come together, and there's going to be a very strong alliance between the planter class and the farmers to preserve that system, to preserve the plantation agricultural economy, cotton production, to sustain the system of slavery, etc., and to preserve the way of life of the South, because they just saw that this is, again, the tradition. This is something that we inherited from our forefathers. This is the way we live. We want to remain this way. We don't want to change. And in the North, there's going to be also an alliance of Northern manufacturers and farmers in the Midwest. Again, just like in the South, there's an alliance of planters and farmers coming together to protect their interest, their way of life. We're going to see that in the same decades, there's also going to be a very strong alliance of Northern manufacturers in the Northeast coming with the farmers of the Midwest in order to protect the way of life of the North, this industrial capitalist economy. They say, no, this economic system has to be dominant. Okay, we have to produce for the market. We have to pay people, for their labor. We need a wage labor economy. Wage labor, for example. This is the way to go. We need more factories. We need to modernize. We need to industrialize. This is how the United States needs to be. So again, there's going to be two groups on each side are going to come together, and they're, of course, they're going to clash in 1860, something that we're actually going to take a glance, to take a look more closely in the second session. We're going to be moving really fast to the outbreak of the Civil War. In a few minutes, we're going to cover in session 2, just a couple of more factors that lead to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1860 and Texas joining the Confederacy. And we're going to look at the Civil War in session 2 when we return. Thank you.